Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Tonight we have something truly spine-chilling for you, 3 disturbing true horror stories that will make you question the very fabric of reality. These aren't just your run-of-the-mill ghost stories or urban legends. No, these are real-life accounts, deeply unsettling experiences that happen to ordinary people, and they could happen to you too. From inexplicable encounters in the dead of night to moments of pure terror that defy logic, these stories will stay with you long after the video ends. But before we dive into these eerie tales, we want to take a moment to express our heartfelt gratitude for each and every one of you who supported this channel. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean more than you can imagine. We are so incredibly thankful for this community, and your continued engagement makes it all possible. It's because of you that we're able to bring these dark and disturbing stories to life. We hope you're all staying safe, looking out for each other, and remembering to trust your instincts, because sometimes what you can't see is more terrifying than what you can. So buckle up, because these true horror stories are about to take you to places you never thought possible. Keep the lights on, stay alert, and get ready for a journey into the unknown. Let's get started with the first story. You won't want to miss this. Story 1: The Haunting of the Cabin at the End of the Road. The road leading to the cabin was not so much a path as an affront to the very notion of progress. A twisting, uneven trail of dirt and jagged stones that meandered through dense woods. The kind of woods that seemed to grow heavier as one traveled deeper into them. It was the kind of isolation that gnawed at the edges of thought, slowly distorting any semblance of normality. I had chosen the cabin precisely for its remoteness, its decay, the suggestion of abandonment qualities that seemed to resonate with me in ways I could not fully understand. The cabin itself was small, a squatter's abode at best, constructed from weathered wood that had long since surrendered to time. There was something repellent about it, the peeling paint, the sagging roof, the cracked windows, yet it stood as an undeniable testament to some forgotten purpose, a monument to utility that had outlived any true need. The few neighboring cabins were scarcely visible through the foliage, with their crumbling exteriors reflecting their owners' neglect. The land was still, suffocating in its quietness, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to breathe. I arrived after another long shift at the factory, my bones aching from the physical labor, my mind tired of the relentless cycle of noise and repetition. I was supposed to find peace here, some form of respite from the grinding weight of life. I had not expected much from the cabin, certainly nothing beyond its isolation. It was the absence of people that I sought most, that void of human presence that whispered to me in a language I couldn't quite place but understood nonetheless. As I entered the cabin, the creaking of the door and the stale air seemed to welcome me, though I did not welcome them in return. Inside the rooms were a scattering of half-forgotten furniture and disorganized remnants of previous tenants. A few stray chairs, the kitchen table covered in dust, the refrigerator humming a strange, oppressive tune. The low light from the overhead bulbs cast sickly shadows along the walls. I closed the door behind me and sank into the nearest chair, the fatigue from the day weighing heavily on me. I was alone, except for the constant, unnerving presence of the woods outside, their silent observation of my every movement. The hours passed, though it felt as though time had stopped altogether. I stripped down to my undershirt and settled beneath the thin, musty blankets on the bed, letting the damp air settle around me. The oppressive stillness pressed in from all sides. My thoughts drifted between the factory and the strange vacancy that surrounded me here, at the end of the world. That was when I first heard it. A voice, faint and oddly detached, floated up from somewhere below the floor. It was up there. I froze. The voice was not loud, nor was it urgent. It was calm, as though it was asking a simple question, one that required no immediate answer. But it was wrong. It should not have been there. The sound of it seemed to hang in the air like a sickly note in a song that could not end. heard a voice that had no business existing in this empty cabin. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore it, but then the pounding began. It was rhythmic at first, methodical, precise, each thud like a deliberate question, a demand that could not be ignored. The walls shuddered with the force of it, as though someone was desperately trying to force their way in. The knocking came from the bedroom door, a violent assault that vibrated through the room, its cadence never erratic, but steady, calculated. There was something hypnotic about it, as though each blow was an invitation to something that I was afraid to understand. I lay there, frozen, my body a statue of terror. I wanted to move, to rise from the bed, to tear open the door and see who or what was causing such a disturbance. But my limbs betrayed me, heavy and unresponsive. In the silence between the knocks, I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears, drowning out the rest of the world. Then a softer sound, a rustle like fabric brushing against skin, filtered into the room, faint, almost too soft to hear, but distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. I blinked in the darkness, my eyes adjusting, my mind working feverishly to catch up with what was happening. Reluctantly, I rose from the bed, my feet hitting the cold floor with a muted slap. I turned on the lights in the hallway, their feeble glow failing to chase the shadows that clung to every corner. The kitchen was empty, as was the bathroom, the rooms all still, as they should have been. But there was something about the quiet, a deadening stillness that felt almost wrong. I walked to the windows, peering out into the night, but saw nothing, no movement, no sign of life. Only the dark woods, looming and oppressive, as though they were watching me. The air seemed to thicken, a suffocating presence in the silence. But the worst was yet to come. As I turned back toward the bedroom, I heard it again, soft and quiet, as though it were coming from the very walls themselves. A shuffling sound, a breath. I turned the corner into the bedroom, and there, sitting on the bed, was a man. He was still, his back straight, his body unnaturally rigid. His eyes were open, fixed on the far wall with a gaze that felt hollow, as though he were staring into nothingness itself. His face was pale, gaunt, his features obscured in the dim light, but there was something fundamentally wrong with him. His clothes were too old and fit poorly, as though they had been pulled from a forgotten era. The fabric hung from his frame like a shroud, too large for his thin body. For a long moment, I simply stood there, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The man was not moving, not even breathing. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My voice was trapped, caught in my throat, swallowed by the silence that enveloped me. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me in place, something worse than fear. Then, as if he had heard my thoughts, the man turned his head slightly, his eyes shifting toward me with a slow, deliberate motion. His face, if it could even be called that, remained vacant, his expression devoid of any emotion. He neither acknowledged my presence nor reacted to my terror. He simply existed. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could take another step, the man dissolved. He vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, fading into the background of the room, until there was nothing left but the lingering feeling of dread. I didn't understand what had happened. I couldn't understand it. The room was empty. The man was gone. The only proof that anything had occurred was the faint echo of my own breathing, ragged and uneven. I called the police, of course. They came, but they found nothing. No sign of a break-in, no indication that anyone had been there at all. The officers were polite, but their eyes were skeptical. They suggested that I might have imagined the entire thing, that it was the result of exhaustion or too much time alone. It was a standard response, dismissive, flat, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing uncertainty that had taken root inside me. They left without offering any real explanation, leaving me with the overwhelming sense that something was deeply wrong with this place, this land, this entire forgotten corner of the world. In the days that followed, I began to notice the oddness of the people around me. The neighbors, when I saw them, spoke in riddles, their eyes never meeting mine for too long. One of them, a man who lived in a cabin further up the hill, seemed to watch me whenever I stepped outside, his gaze fixed and unblinking, as though he knew something that I did not. The landlord was no better, his face always hidden in shadow, his words vague and unhelpful. When I asked him about the strange occurrences in the cabin, he hinted at stories perhaps that were never fully told. I began to feel the weight of some presence that pressed in from all sides. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, had become my prison. I could no longer tell if the things I heard, the things I saw, were real. The silence outside the cabin, the whispers in the wind, the strange hum of the old refrigerator, it all blended together into a symphony of unease, each note more dissonant than the last. And now as I sit here writing these words, I wonder, was I ever truly alone? Or had I always been watched, observed, by something that lived in the corners of the world just beyond the reach of my understanding? The thought lingers insistent. I can feel it like a breath on the back of my neck. And yet, as I wait for the inevitable, I find myself questioning who is up there now. Story 2: The Van in the Dark. The dirt road had always been there, even though I didn't remember ever consciously choosing it. The town, too, had always been there, though it seemed to have no true form. It was as if the place existed to be forgotten, only ever reappearing when I needed it, when I was lost enough to need its hollow embrace. Some nights when I stood at the edge of it, the feeling of it stretching out, devoid of any end, crept into my bones. Time and place felt irredeemably broken, as though I had somehow stepped beyond the world as I knew it, into a half-remembered dream that would never fully manifest. When I left work that night, the chill in the air was unbearable, an unnatural frost, seeping into my skin and stealing my warmth. I was numb as I crossed the parking lot, dragging my feet across the cracked pavement. My breath formed heavy clouds in the night, a vapor of something far more dangerous than cold. The night felt more oppressive than I could describe, each step echoing with an eerie finality, the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest. I don't remember exactly how I got to the dirt road. It simply was, and I was on it, as if fate or whatever force governs this town had placed me there. I looked at the trees that lined the road, their limbs twisted and thick, their shadows stretching unnaturally long in the moonlight. It was hard to tell where the road ended and the forest began, the borders shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The air was still, thick with the kind of silence that only grows in places where time itself has decided to leave. And then, like a malignant presence, the van appeared. At first I thought it was a mirage, some trick of the fog, or perhaps my mind's attempt to fill the silence with something tangible. But the van was real. Faintly illuminated by the strange, pallid light from the half-hidden moon, it loomed at the far end of the road, a stark, white shape in the darkness. I couldn't make out the details, the shape, the structure. It was a van, yes, but somehow, more like an object that didn't belong here. It was like an artifact left behind by some forgotten civilization, discarded and left to rot, but still capable of moving. As I stood there staring at it, I felt something inside of me stir a primal recognition, a sense that I should not be here, that whatever the van was, I was not meant to encounter it. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a thing, an entity in its own right, and it had been waiting for me. The first thing I noticed was the way it moved. It didn't drive, it slid. There was no sound of tires on gravel, no roar of the engine. It simply drifted closer, like a dark shadow slowly spilling across the earth. The wheels never seemed to turn. It just came, and with it the air grew thicker, as though the very atmosphere was pulling inward, suffocating everything in its reach. The smell of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils, suffusing the air in a manner that felt intentional, as though something was preparing to claim me. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. My body seemed frozen, my thoughts tangled in the thick web of fear, and something worse, something darker. The van grew closer still, its headlights glowing faintly now, not with any ordinary illumination but with a sickly, unnatural gleam like the eyes of something watching you, but never blinking. Then, a voice. The sound of it pierced the air, an unintelligible whisper that seemed to wrap itself around my very soul. I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, as if something inside of me was being pulled toward the sound. The whisper wasn't a voice in the way I understood voices, though. It was like a presence, a soundless cry that reverberated through the world, pulling at something deeper than surface comprehension. It wasn't meant to be heard by the ears. It was felt. Come closer. The voice wasn't human. The more I strained to understand it, the less human it felt. It was like the scraping of nails on the inside of your mind, too familiar yet too alien to grasp fully. It was a sound that belonged to something that didn't belong to this world, something that only half existed. "We've been waiting," it murmured, and this time I felt it in my bones. The van inched closer, its headlights now fully visible, and I could see shapes moving within. Shadows, no faces, but something else. Something that shouldn't have been able to move like it did. It didn't speak in words anymore. It spoke in the vibrations of the ground beneath me, in the pulsing thrum of the air, in the way the trees shuddered as if they too were afraid. I turned and ran, without a thought, without a plan. My feet hit the uneven ground in a blur, a rush of frantic energy that barely seemed to keep up with the terror that pushed me forward. Behind me, the van followed, its presence never fading, always just a step behind, as though it had always been behind me. As though it had always been following me. The road had become something else entirely now. It no longer existed in the way roads do, as a mere path to travel. It was a tunnel, a narrowing slit of space, pulling me deeper into a dark nowhere. The trees around me grew thicker, their twisted limbs now stretching out to catch at my skin. When the air pressed in from all sides, my mind, already fraying, began to unravel completely, the world around me becoming more dreamlike, more impossible. I didn't know if I was still running down the same road. I didn't know if I was still in the same place. And then, through the haze of my panic, I saw it. The figure. It stood in the middle of the road, blocking my path. Dark silhouette against the faint light of the van. Its form was human, and yet there was something terribly wrong with it. It had no distinct features, no face. Its limbs were elongated, twisted. It was the embodiment of every nightmare I had ever had, every shapeless horror that had ever crawled from the dark recesses of my mind. It did not speak, it did not move. It simply watched. I felt it then. The suffocating weight of its gaze. It was as if it could see me, see all of me, my thoughts, my fears, my very soul. And it didn't care. It simply waited. The van behind me had stopped. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it had never moved at all, and I had simply been walking into its trap from the very beginning. I didn't know. My mind was no longer tethered to any coherent thoughts. All that was left was the cold, the dark, and the oppressive weight of something too vast to understand. But the figure in the road spoke then. Its voice was not heard, but felt like an old wound reopened. "You are already here," it said. "You have always been here, and now you will always be." I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My limbs were frozen, as if the very earth had decided I was part of it now, trapped in place by some unseen force. The van's lights flickered, casting long shadows across the trees. And in the distance, I heard a faint sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. My eyes, no longer able to focus, scanned the edges of the road. Figures, faces, hundreds of them, all standing just beyond the trees. Eyes without expression, bodies without purpose, watching. And then I understood. The van was not a thing, it was a place. A place where time had stopped, where everyone was lost, forever suspended in the depths of some cosmic blackness. I was in it now. There was no escaping it. The van, the figures, the whispers, they were all part of me, part of my unraveling. And the worst part was knowing that I had always been here, always part of it. There was no place left to run. The road had always led here, and now there was nothing but the waiting, the eternal stretch of the void, and the endless watch of the eyes that never blink. Story 3: Phone Call That Haunts. The silence was profound. After I set the receiver down, the room seemed to settle into something far too still, far too heavy for comfort. The hum of the refrigerator, once so subtle, became an oppressive sound that thrummed through my head, a persistent noise that seemed to pulse with an insistent urgency, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I glanced at my wife, her face now turned towards the floor, her fingers interlocked tightly in her lap. Her breathing had slowed but remained shallow, as though she too were feeling the weight of whatever had been unleashed in the room. What was that, I asked, though the words felt pointless the moment they left my mouth. There was no answer to that question, no real answer that could explain the strangeness of the moment. It felt as if the question itself had been swallowed by the silence, rendered meaningless by the void that had opened up between us. She didn't look up. Her voice, when it came, was faint and distant, as though it were being spoken from far away, perhaps from somewhere far outside the house. I don't know, but it wasn't. It wasn't normal. I nodded, though I felt no reassurance in her words. The quiet was growing thicker, more suffocating. I wanted to move, to break free of it, but something held me in place. Something invisible and intangible, like a pull that I couldn't resist. I stared at the phone on the table, watching it as though it might move of its own accord, as though it might suddenly ring again, and this time I would answer. I felt the temptation and almost compulsive need to pick up the receiver and listen again. But I knew that if I did, something far worse would happen. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. It was a certainty that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. The phone sat there, now completely still, yet its presence loomed larger than ever before. In that moment, it seemed more than just a simple object. It seemed like a symbol of something terrible, something that had breached the boundary between the known and the unknown, something that had slipped through the cracks of reality and was now hanging in the air between us. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. The shadows in the room had grown deeper, more twisted, and I wondered for a moment if the walls themselves had somehow shifted, if the house had subtly rearranged itself while we weren't paying attention. It felt as though the house itself was no longer solid, no longer a safe space. It felt like a hollow shell that could be peeled away at any moment, revealing something dark and unnameable lurking beneath. There was a breath I whispered, almost to myself. My voice sounded strange in the silence, as though it didn't belong to me. It was so close to me. She looked at me then, her eyes wide, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or something worse. She seemed to know exactly what I meant, though she didn't say anything. The weight of her gaze was unbearable, and I looked away, back toward the phone. It sat there, unchanged. But everything had changed. The tension in the room had thickened, as though the very air were becoming heavier with each passing second. I could feel it pressing against me, suffocating me. It was a feeling I couldn't describe, an unease that gnawed at my insides, making it difficult to breathe. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears now, the steady thrum of it seeming out of place in the unnatural stillness of the room. My pulse quickened, and I felt a growing pressure in my chest, as though something was tightening around me, something unseen, something suffocating. I stood up abruptly, unable to stay still any longer. My wife flinched at the sudden movement, but I didn't care. I needed to move. I needed to break free from the crushing weight of the silence. I walked toward the window, hoping that the sight of the outside world would somehow calm me. But when I pulled back the curtain, I was met with nothing but the dark emptiness of the night. No stars, no streetlights, just the inky blackness of the suburban streets stretching out before me, an expanse of nothingness that seemed to go on forever. It was as though the world itself had ceased to exist beyond the confines of the house. The thought made my stomach lurch, and I quickly turned away from the window, my eyes darting back to the phone. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, to flee from whatever invisible thing had entered the house with that phone call. But my legs felt like lead, and the air around me seemed to have thickened even further, as if every step I took was a struggle against some unseen force that held me in place. My mind raced, searching for some logical explanation, something that could make sense of the terror creeping through my veins. But there was nothing. There was only the silence. Only the dread. "Let's just go to bed," my wife said suddenly, breaking the quiet like a hammer striking glass. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an urgency that I hadn't expected. I turned to look at her, and she was standing now, her face pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though she were staring at something just beyond my shoulder. She was trembling, and though she had spoken the words, she didn't seem to believe them. "I don't know if I can sleep," I replied, my voice raw, strained. My mouth felt dry, my tongue thick in my mouth. I hadn't realized how tense I was until the words left my lips. The air in the room felt electric, charged with a strange energy that made my skin crawl. I wanted to say more, to ask her if she felt it too, this presence that had crept into the house, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. She took a hesitant step toward me, her eyes locked on the floor. We have to ignore it, whatever it was. It's just a glitch." Nothing more. Her words felt hollow, like a feeble attempt to convince herself that everything was still normal, that nothing had changed. But I could hear the tremor in her voice, and I knew she didn't believe it. "Not really." I nodded, though the motion felt mechanical, like something I was doing out of habit. I didn't know if I believed it either. There was no logical explanation for what had just happened. It couldn't be a glitch. It couldn't be a wrong number. Whatever that was, whatever that sound had been, it was not a random occurrence. It was something intentional, something designed, something that had been waiting for us. We went to bed, though sleep didn't come. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on me, and I felt it whatever it was. That presence. That thing that had entered the house with the phone call. It wasn't gone. It wasn't finished with us. I tried to close my eyes to drift into sleep, but I couldn't. The silence felt unbearable, like a weight on my chest, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for us to understand. But what was there to understand? I didn't know, and the not knowing made it worse. It made the silence unbearable. The phone sat silently on the table in the other room, but I could hear it. I could hear it calling to me. And that brings us to the end of today's video, featuring 3 truly disturbing true horror stories that we hope have left you feeling uneasy. These real-life accounts remind us that the world can hold terrifying secrets just beneath the surface, and sometimes the scariest things aren't from the pages of fiction, but from the unsettling events that happen in our own lives. We truly appreciate all of your support. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions allow us to continue sharing these spine-chilling stories with you, and we can't thank you enough for being part of this incredible community. Remember to stay safe, always trust your instincts, and never underestimate the strange and inexplicable things that may lurk around you. We hope you're taking care of yourselves and looking out for those around you, because sometimes the scariest moments happen when you least expect them. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already so you can join us for more terrifying stories in the future. We can't wait to share more with you. Until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and stay alert. You never know what might be lurking around the corner. We'll see you in the next video.